Welcome to The Chat. Come behind the inbound scenes of some of the world's fastest growing companies. For the past 10 years as Chatmetrics, we've had an exclusive inside view of how these industry leaders are revolutionising inbound marketing and sales across diverse sectors. Each week, we bring you conversations with top minds in marketing and sales who share insider secrets and strategies for driving inbound success. Join us on The Chat, your front row seat to the future of inbound. Today on The Chat, we're bringing back a fan favourite, Monique Olan, our very first guest and someone who shaped how this show thinks about go-to-market strategy. Monique's back to talk about one of the most important shifts happening in B2B today, and that's the move from growth at all costs to true buyer centricity. We're going to unpack where scaling companies get it wrong, how silos are still killing GDM execution, and why most revenue leaders are flying blind when it comes to sustainable growth. And right in the middle of that conversation, we're introducing something new we've been working and thinking a lot about at Chatmetrics, which is this whole concept of buyer-led conversions. It's our way of operationalising everything Monique preaches, aligning marketing, sales and customer success, and how buyers actually move, not how all charts say they should. Monique, welcome back to The Chat.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Let's jump straight in. So let's start with the hill you'll die on. Why is buyer centricity more than just a philosophy? And what's the real risk of staying stuck in it like a profit-only mindset?
Yeah. So, I work with companies of a lot of different sizes. The companies that I tend to work with are usually in like high growth into mid-market, but I also mentor a lot with early stage startups that could be anywhere from like napkin idea or into like their first customers getting their pre-seed kind of funding. And hill that I'll die on, which is what I talk about all the time, is that the buyer's need or want needs to be at the center of what you're doing as a business at all times. So whether you are a product or a service, whether you're B2B or B2C, this is a foundational concept. Products and services exist to serve a buyer need or want. Now, we're predominantly B2B. I know most of my clients are all in the B2B space or B2B2C. And so typically it is a need as opposed to want. Not most people are wanting a CRM system. They need it. But the goal is to serve that need. And where I start to have seen some friction in my time working for publicly traded companies, working for smaller companies, is at some point there's a time in growth where you've been serving that need and you start to possibly consider or actually compromise the delivery to that need of the customer in order to expand your profit margin. And that's what that's kind of all about, is how do you avoid that transition? How do you stay buyer-centric, not compromise those core focuses and values in order to see if you can move that needle in the profit margin?
Very interesting concept. I'll say recently, about 3 months ago, we had an ex-client come back to us who moved away in terms of trying to strike efficiencies and moved over to an AI chatbot to save costs. Unfortunately for them, the downside was that the reduction in lead generation and then all of the flow-on effects from that, the reduction in return on ad spend, the increase in client acquisition costs, were such that that equation really didn't work. And so very, very interesting. And you and I totally align when it comes to buyer centricity, that's for sure. And excited to talk about the buyer-led conversion concept shortly as well.
Yeah.
In terms of experiences where you've seen this in play, do you have any examples as to where it's either not, you've seen it start to negatively impact the business, or you've seen the opposite where they've been in that, profit mindset where you've been able to shift into a buyer-centric mindset, and what would the impact?
Yeah, a couple examples I'll go through. I want to emphasize one quick thing is, as I work with a lot of companies that are constantly looking for investor funding, I'm not saying you're not in business to make profit, right? We're all in business to make a profit. And it's not just a matter of like ethics and values either. It is a matter of, your greatest sustainable growth and success is tied to your ability to be buyer-centric. And so a couple examples I can think through. One is actually when I was working with a large global publicly traded company. we launched a software solution, and part of it was launched with a few. Here I'm going to talk about how they positioned it and what they launched with. They highlighted a few key software features that they decided to double down on and expand based off of what they thought they could make the most amount of margin out of in that product, being the way that the model worked for their pricing model, being able to get customers to buy up into. Lo and behold, we started to do some go-to-market effort around it. And part of what I like to do when I'm running that is also get the customer or prospect feedback in real time. Is we did an initial kind of teaser launch and got some feedback on key features, functionalities, and things like that would be most beneficial to them. And during that initial rollout, we got statistically what they picked as like the path we want to lead down for product features and functionality to get the greatest potential profit growth out of was not at all what was in demand. There were actually two other key features that were in demand for them that they would actually buy into faster for the product. So there was actually not only a misguided assumption into how they expanded the product and then how we were positioning in market based on this kind of what we think could gain us the most, but we were actually just missing entirely on where we would get the conversion, which is people wanted A and B, but we were focusing in on C. And so it was one of those that as we started to go through that beta and that, or not the beta, but the official like pre-launch teaser, we got this data into the rest of the product team. We got it into the rest of leadership, and we shifted some of the actual product focus. And so we had a really successful launch as we started to go into full scale launch within past the existing customer base for getting the test and feedback and actually out into market, and a lot higher traction, better conversions across anyone that was net new and key account expansion. That was a good example of at least like righting our wrong in the process. But I even see it where I've been recently working with a couple just as a volunteer mentor with a few startups that are trying to position and market. And they are in a mindset a little bit more, not in a misguided way of being the solution provider and not able to actually put themselves in the buyer's shoes. And so they end up leaning into some key functionality and we're solving this problem. And as I'm working with them, I'm like, if you put yourself in the shoes of the actual customer you have, that's not a problem for them. That's a problem for the service provider. And so we've been doing some practices on how do you really, truly get into the shoes of your customer, understand what they need and want, and make sure you're actually building a product that serves that. And that has been, hopefully very helpful for each of them, but definitely great conversations that I've had with them to work through those challenges.
Well, history is littered with the corpses of organizations that have amazing products that solve problems that nobody wants solved.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is where I find it interesting because some people be like, I see this market, I see this gap in the market, I'm going to create a product for it. And they're like, cool, there's a reason why there is a gap in the market for that product. And yeah, that is a huge kind of misstep, and it can result in a lot of lost dollars spent on trying to scale that. Dollars, time, effort, everything.
So how do you broach that subject when you're working with an organization that's got their mind set, they've already taken steps down a particular path, obviously level of investment made? How do you, hey fellas, maybe you haven't exactly got this one right?
Yeah. A lot of the work that I end up doing with clients is a lot in that research, and then also how do we map our revenue projections based on it. So what I really like to get into the weeds on is understanding what is our current potential growth with the product as it is versus where if we were to correct it, what does that growth look like? What is our short-term and long-term wins? So sometimes a good example is I've worked with a client recently who identified a single market as their core market to go after. It had to deal with IT, but their kind of focus on how they got to them was a little off. And so we did a little bit of writing on what is it they really care about and why your solution is solving that. And then how do we actually, another hill that I'll die on, which is the riches are in the niches. How do you align to that niche and make sure you're truly like speaking the words they care about, make sure you're hitting on their core demands, but also mapping their longevity with you and understanding customer lifetime value. Is this a kind of one and done kind of customer? Are they going to be out of my kind of cycle with me within a year? How do I maintain them? How do I grow within that key account? There's a lot of ways in which we practice on making sure we're aware of the buyer's potential at all stages of their journey with you in order to ensure that there is a sustainable growth path And then how do we actually operationalize on that? And I think that's the key component.
So for me, what I see with organizations is one of the challenges where they believe there's a solution. How do you test that? How do you actually, you've explained almost in my mind the next step. What's the first step in actually recognizing whether or not that is the problem that the customers want?
Yeah. Speak to those customers and buyers. I can't overemphasize how critical it is to actually have the ear and the words and the conversations with those in market. When we're working with really early stage startups, the number of times we just emphasize getting one-on-ones with key people who would actually be your buyer and getting that feedback, real feedback is going to be important. There's always supplemental research data that you can get into markets. And that is always important, especially as you're talking with investors, for them to understand the baseline market, like what is your actual TAM, what's your available market to go after versus where you are in it. But getting real feedback, and this is a huge component of also getting that product launched. The biggest wins you have is not just getting their feedback at the beginning, but real customer success stories. The people who excel have a deep and presentable in their brand experience of their customers with their product or service. One thing that I constantly emphasize on is how history repeats itself in marketing, sales, our practices, and go-to-market. Authenticity is at the forefront of marketing today. This is not a new thing. It is just we are kind of at the depth of the growth hacking era and at a deep place now where data privacy is important. Authenticity and understanding of what the product really does for someone's really important. And so when you can be a company that is oriented against what that buyer really cares about and can authentically present it in your awareness stages, in your sales conversations with them, able to show real customers with real value, and then also post-purchase, supporting them in a way that's still very buyer-centric and making sure that it's about their needs and you're solving them. This creates a significantly more sustainable revenue pattern and a sustainable growth pattern for the company.
Some of the most successful organizations that we have the pleasure of dealing with as our clients are the ones that review the chat transcripts and actually use those customer conversations to help drive product roadmap and new features. Most recently, there's been a particular customer that is a service-based business, and they've got their offer and they're very fixed to that offer. And we found that through the chats we're having with the website visitors that there were 3 particular questions that were getting asked that we were answering no to. And part of our continuous improvement process is to say, okay, it's not just about how can we improve the process. We'll also go through and see where there might be any gaps in our client's offer. And often they're not in a position, not interested, or it is so far removed from their core business that it's not something that they're interested in. But I'd say about 30% of the time, it is something that they will actually start to build in and bring as an offer, particularly when they see that the audience that they're attracting, there is demand for that particular solution. And so it's the ones that really do review the chat transcripts and use that voice of customer to help drive their product roadmap and feature development. We see those, they're the businesses that are head and shoulders in each of their sectors for sure.
Yeah. I've also seen where that voice of customer can't get lost in a department or siloed somewhere. So this is one of those, if I was to give some advice into any company to get that voice of the customer more activated upon, because that's the big question, is how do you take that input and actually do something about it, is don't let it get lost in the small processes. The number of times I've seen sales conversations where they see all the objections they have, and that never goes on to maybe marketing to figure out how can they preemptively get over those objections before a lead gets into the pipeline, or post-purchase customer onboarding teams who work with the customers and get the feedback on this is what they dive into first in our product. How do you get that into the sales team so that they can make sure they're mentioning that at the sales point so that they convert better? There's so much opportunity for that within the entire customer journey and how they engage with different teams. But one of the biggest falters we see as companies start to scale is that they start to create more silos within the teams, whether that is because of leadership, whether that's because of technology and tools. But a lot of times these very subjective and very qualitative data points can get lost or stuck in just this little field in your CRM system and not passed on to someone to turn into something that can actually matter for your bottom line.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, that we'll talk a bit more about silos later, but the cost to organisations of a silo is immeasurable. The loss, I mean, you could probably go through and analyse, and we've seen it a couple of times quite vividly. We deal with marketing because they own the website, but we're an extension to the sales team. So we deal very closely with the sales leadership. And, I've seen meetings where there's been a lot of friction in between. Growth hacking, we're out of the phase of growth hacking, or growth hacking is dead. How does that idea tie into the demand for more authentic and buyer-aligned strategies?
Yeah, I mean, this could be a deep topic for like multiple hours I could dive into, but there's multiple factors that go into like the transition of how, especially in B2B, buyers have engaged with their types of products and solutions and services. And I think a big contributor is actually the post-pandemic era. So just looking at SaaS companies, an example, when we first actually had the pandemic and went into lockdown and everyone was working remote, there was this boom of SaaS companies and solutions to solve the gaps, all of the new gaps. But what we've seen once kind of something gets more normalized, we see this happen, again, history repeating itself. At some point, okay, we've now adapted these 20 different solutions to help us stopgap this bleed of how do we operate as a business, now fully remote. Now they've gotten to their 1-year renewals, their 2-year, their 3-year renewals, and they're more educated on what it is they need and what functions in the business. They've adapted their internal operations, and now they often look to consolidate their software. Or they start to look at, did I buy some software that we're not using? And I've worked with multiple companies where we've been in that process of how do we actually, one, lean into the right ones, eliminate wasted spend. And so this comes back to, are you actually aligned to solving a problem for that buyer? Were you doing it well? And were you messaging, positioning, and supporting them in a way that made sure they were aware of that and taking advantage of that? And so it's not this just like, marketing, we want to make sure we're always buyer-centric and putting them first kind of concept. It really is going to be a make or break for your business as you get into a company. It's one of those aspects where it can really make a big difference in how you operate and how you're actually able to expand the product.
So we've been talking a lot about buyer-led conversions lately as a shift from seller-driven or marketing-driven funnels to buyer-driven journeys. How does that resonate with the shift that you're seeing in the market at the moment?
Yeah, so that connects a little bit to the last point we were talking about, where you have more educated buyers. And you also have to look at the technology that we're using today to reach buyers. So we are no longer in an era where most of our effort was TV ads and radio ads and billboards that got people. We went digital. And so the touch points for them went digital. Now, at the beginning of this process, and I hate always moving into history, but again, history helps you understand the future. And one of the key points here is we went digital. And one of the things I remember when I was still in a marketing agency was we sold so hard on the way we could track the buyer journey and influence it. But we've had the shift now where buyers own a lot of the way the channels operate for themselves. So that's one component, right? So a lot of the channels we're going to them is either passive, like getting to them on social channels, or it is their action that triggers it, such as a search either in AI or in Google to find something. But there's also, to the tie point back to authenticity, is because they have grown so accustomed to the amount of marketing and sales efforts we do in these channels, a lot of times decisions are not anymore being made purely on who's going to advertise in front of me, knowing that I'm this type of person, but more a matter of their connections again. We go back to old school techniques, but today, some of the biggest decisions that I see other CMOs making, or I see other leaders making, are behind closed doors in Slack communities for explicitly CMOs of SaaS companies. I'm in one where we have spaces where we say, okay, guys, I am testing out product right now to help with my team and our operations, and here's my feedback. Or we go in there and we ask, I'm looking for XYZ. Does anyone have any recommendations or experience? And so you're finding people going into these very private channels that you as an advertiser and a marketer or a salesperson may not necessarily have access to. And they're looking for that feedback. So you get back to this whole, if you aren't being at the best interest of the buyer, that's going to be talked about in those spaces that you have no control over.
It's almost like there's three types of information sources that I've seen really come to the fore, and their own peer groups and communities like you were just talking about. Certainly for B2B, LinkedIn, I think, is a place where a lot of people go to have a conversation, do some research, maybe not even the conversation, but do the research. And one of the other places that they go to, and interestingly, we've found this with not just inbound, but with outbound activities as well, is their website. So I remember the last time we were chatting, you asked the question, can you afford to own 70% of your buyer's journey? And the reality is I don't think any organisation can. Large enterprise can have a big influence on that and certainly can potentially penetrate some of those other communities. But the place where you can, and again, I think the place that we focused on is the website is one of the places that people go to do their research, because that's what you say about yourself. That's where you provide your evidence and your proof and the information. So they're going to go there and have a look as part of the research, and they'll then work amongst the peer groups and LinkedIn to verify or seek further information and get feedback. So I saw a report Gartner published, I think about 2 months ago now, 3 months ago. The old Challenger sales days where the percentage supposedly of B2B buyers journey that was done before they raised their hand was 53%. Gartner have now said it's up to 80% of the buyer's journey for B2B businesses are completed before they're even raising their hand with an organisation.
Yeah.
And at that stage, there's very little influence left for a sales rep, so to speak. So, the more you can influence in those earlier stages. And I think buyer-led conversions for us is around our experience on the websites over the last decade and the conversations we've had with buyers. And we're up to, the scale blows my mind. I don't think I'd actually looked at these stats last time we were talking, but we have had getting close to 3 million conversations now. We've delivered well over 300,000 leads and over $5 billion in pipeline. And with that, there is some insight that you gain. We were talking earlier about actually there's a difference between knowing statistics and having some education versus actually living in the trenches and the experience that the real world brings. And where we've ended, and we're using this language of buyer-led journeys, we've been doing something for almost the entire decade, which has made us successful, that we didn't really have a name for or a framework for or understand it. And there's 12 components to what we do. But in a nutshell, what it is, we let the buyer lead the journey. We let the buyer lead the conversation at their pace, anonymously. There's a whole, like I said, a list of 12 pieces to the framework to get it right. But in a nutshell, it really is the buyer that's leading the conversion, not the other way around. And the results are ridiculously phenomenal. I struggle with a credibility perspective, because when you're talking to people and say, we actually quadrupled the conversion rate for our last customer, I don't believe it. And in fact, I could bring up an email right now that I got last week where it says, 4 times, that's where you lost me. Impossible. So it's okay. You know what? It's not you're losing me. It's like you're the one that's missing out on the clients, and it'll be one of your competitors that gets them. So I think it's a good timing for us. And I really do think there's a lot of alignment when you talk about the customer centricity, particularly in this environment where cash isn't as valuable as it was before, and expectations in terms of the KPIs is very different to what it was. Return on ad spend, client acquisition costs, the primary focus. No longer can you have 36-month payback for client acquisition costs on a client acquisition cost. It's unless you're running actually a profitable business and you're going through a cash burn where you're not seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, then it's a very difficult position to be in terms of grabbing some cash.
Yeah. And it's interesting because being a marketer today is probably one of the most delightful things as a consumer myself or a buyer myself, but also one of the most hardest things to do as an actual person having to hit performance numbers and actually drive pipeline, which is we are seeing this, like, to your point, most people are decided upon before they even get to having a conversation with a sales rep. There's so many dynamics to what goes into what influences that buyer before they get to that stage. So you think about companies that have founders doing guest speaking on podcasts. You think about those that have ongoing content that they're optimizing for AI and for search, that they are doing, social engagement, that they are doing paid advertising, that they are doing local events or virtual events, that they're doing all the multiple things that compose what we call kind of integrated marketing strategies. But we're back to this stage where, like, the understanding of what's truly driving that point of what brought them here, which is a question that still companies keep asking, which I know it's so hard because we set ourselves up for this, right? As marketers, especially as marketers, we said, oh my gosh, we can track all the things. Let us show you how we can track where this lead came from. And now we're having to double back and say, okay, but look, it takes like anywhere from 7 to 20 some odd touch points to get them to actually convert and engage in some way. We can no longer attribute to just one anymore. And we're in this lovely place where we set ourselves up for this. But as a marketer, it becomes a challenge because without a significant trust within your leadership team and having the right understanding of what marketing does and how marketing and sales are so intertwined and how much work goes into that awareness stage and consideration stage that you're not actually able to see with the buyer, but you're doing stuff in market that is clearly influencing it. And then making sure that everyone understands that's going on, but maybe aren't able to fully track it. It is now kind of a hard place. But as someone who's buying, and I'm often buying software and services for me or for my clients, I am like happy with the transparency out there, with the authenticity that I can find. And it makes a huge influence into what I decide to buy into. And so it's that like awkward as a marketer, I feel the pain, but I also appreciate the outcome. But it definitely just leans harder into the softer elements that some people were able to overlook when we had like the SaaS boom of everyone just needed something to solve a gap. The things like being really good on understanding your buyer, who they are and what they need, positioning well against it, and what we talk about, which is the death of the sea of sameness, which is being able to stand out. You can't just be sitting in the shadows of Salesforce doing something similar to them and just hoping to ride their curtails. You need to really know your niche. You need to know how to speak to them, be where they are, and authentically present in a way that they can discover you and want to engage.
Exactly. I've found that it seems to me, and I'm interested in your observation here, but it seems to me that there's a very much a higher tendency for businesses in the first instance to run outbound as opposed to invest in marketing. It's almost, and I guess, look, to a certain extent, it makes some sense in the very early stages to verify a market. The easiest way to verify whether or not you've got a product and there is a demand for it is to go and have conversations. And I guess I've got to say transparently, it's probably one of my biggest regrets that we didn't move to marketing earlier on. We've been a cold outbound business for a long time. And, that's an insight that I've garnered over the last couple of years for sure, a regret about. But I think it's almost like I see it regularly. Businesses start with the outbound component as opposed to investing in marketing in the early days.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It is a great way to get some initial traction, some initial insight, but it's definitely not scalable. And it's also something that can quickly feel very spammy over time if you try to scale it in the wrong way. But it is a way to think about how, as a marketer, another thing that I say often that I know people hate hearing from me, but it is also like a good indicator of a good marketer is that I constantly say it depends. So this as a tactic or a approach, it depends on how it fits into your mix. But yes, there's a fine balance of certain brand and fundamental like foundational elements that need to be done before you do anything. And then there's certain what I consider like activation in market of those core foundations that you figure out what could be some of those either quick win or low-hanging fruit opportunities. And how do you also consider activating in market that prepares for the long term? Depending on what stage the company's in, you can't just constantly be going after these quick win, opportunities and just outbound. You need to be building some traction on long term. There is, if you want to call it just SEO or SEO plus AI optimization now for sites and copy, that is still very critical for your business, especially as you watch the trends of people change in the way in which they discover and how much more they're leaning into Copilot or Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever tool they have at hand that's AI oriented. The amount of times that they're just going to the preview that AI is generating at the top before looking at any search results now. It is a prominent aspect of whether your business has some potential long-term. And if you're not building that earlier, there's no way you're going to generate in those results later.
Yeah.
So there is a fine balance of what that is. It also depends on if you're really early stage. I've had some people who are still like just getting their product to their first customer. and they are in these, like, I associate with accelerator groups and incubators. And they're like, I paid this guy to do SEO for me. And I'm like, okay, we're a little early. We don't have a lot of dollars to play with. You are in I need to get to first customer, get some insight, get some feedback, adapt my product and start to scale. That is not where your dollars need to go yet. But there's definitely points in which you need to start thinking about the short and long-term picture. And so it's always a very complex mix of those type of tactics and channels that you take. And then based on understanding where your customer is, again, that buyer centricity that comes to the forefront. You can easily try to do outbound and accidentally hit the wrong person. You could do organic work and then realize you're speaking the wrong touch points or a problem in the work you're doing, and you're not getting in front of the right people. So knowing your buyer is so fundamental to how you operate and what kind of tactics and channels you go after, whether it is your kind of outbound or inbound type of technique.
Market validation, I think that's almost, for early stage organizations, it's a great way to do market validation. Whereas someone like Procter & Gamble, if they wanted to launch a new brand, well, they'll have focus groups. So it'll be the marketing team running the entire market validation of that new brand or product. Whereas for smaller organizations that are just starting to get into the market, then it's a perfect way for them because you get the validation by getting the customers. That sort of helps tick so many boxes in terms of helping cash flow and everything else along the way. And esteem and confidence, which can't be underplayed. So let's get back onto this topic of silos. Why is true buyer centricity impossible without real alignment between marketing, sales, and customer success?
Yeah, they are all touching and influencing the understanding of your buyer across the journey of your solution, from beginning awareness through to actually being purchased and to longevity. And so when you accidentally create these silos, you break a lot of that connective tissue. I'm such an advocate of this. They need to live and breathe together, right? We've seen the history of incentivizing groups off of their performance numbers that are a little bit too vanity and not aligned to the bigger picture. There's understanding marketing against how it drives revenue, but there also has to be some room and understanding. There's other data points that are qualitative that we need to be tracking across that journey. We go back to that example I talked about earlier, is the number of times I've seen us lose customers near the end because we just didn't get the positioning right at the beginning, or we had so many sales conversations that never happened simply because people didn't see the core value that they're actually using after they activated. We've seen faulty onboarding, like especially automated onboarding for any like SaaS companies that are completely like product led, and they build a product led experience that is not actually focused on what they need to activate off most. I focus a lot on marketing, sales, and customer success because they're the key touch points that a customer experiences from pre-purchase to post-purchase. But I also want to bring in like your product development team needs to be in these conversations too. If they're looking at the what's next in the product beyond the fixes and the bugs that might be coming up from customer feedback, you need to have those conversations happening between those teams, and they need to be all oriented around key foundational aspects of the buyer that should be worked on from their perspective.
So this is where your loop logic go-to-market framework comes in, isn't it? How does that help teams operate in sync with how buyers actually move?
Yeah, so this loop logic go-to-market, or GTM, is this idea that you have your positioning, your pipeline, your people internally and externally, and then your performance all aligned around a buyer-led operating system. So that is, operating system consists of your foundational knowledge, your foundational understandings, your actual go-to-market components and how you pull certain levers to activate, which we'll come back to in a second. But it also means your systems and tools that are driving that, as well as your metrics. And so you need to be thinking about how are all these teams operating off of the same core metrics. You're all driving business revenue, but there are metrics from each of those different teams that help it inform how they're activating towards that revenue. So those are the 4 key components for what I kind of consider take up across these different departments to fuel this buyer-led operating system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the working to a framework to gather that alignment and beyond 2 silos that there's obviously some conflict or just separation between. Doesn't even have to be conflict, but just a gap. Sometimes can also hide lack of alignment between other areas as well. Customer sales and marketing is obviously the one that gets spoken about the most, but the reality is customer success, product are just as important, because it's one of those things. I remember through my career, most of my years have been spent in a distribution type business which gets product to market. And so that the pointy end, it's the sales team that are the ones that are closing the deals. They have owning the majority of the customer relationships. And often the challenge was managing the sales personalities into, hey, you're not the most important part of this organisation. There's not one part of the organisation that will operate without the other parts of the operation all working together. Things like, for instance, even as far as HR, if you don't have all the HR systems working in the business, then you're not going to have operational staff to deliver the products out to where you need them to be once you've closed the deal. The customer accounts department, even in terms of making sure the money comes in to pay your wages each month. All of the single components. I think there sometimes is a lack of understanding of the importance of all of those different components in an organisation to actually deliver the outcomes. And this placing self-importance on any particular part of that can be so damaging. And again, I actually had a conversation yesterday with a gentleman that coaches CEOs and business leaders, in particularly around helping them increase the performance of their teams into high-performing teams. And one of the things that we spoke about, and I mentioned, is that I think as the older I get, I realise that this concern that often we all have where we worry about what other people think about us, the reality is they're not thinking about us at all. It's us that's doing all the thinking. And that sort of flows through, I think. I've noticed more and more that we all live in our own bubbles to a certain extent. We all have the self-interest to start with before we have the outer interest. And it varies, obviously, in degrees. But the reality is, if we don't look after ourselves, we can't look after anyone else. And I think there's a good natural mechanism to keep us focused on ourselves as a starting point.
Yeah.
Some places that's a little bit overburdened in individuals, and we've seen it even with our own team with recruiting. We've had some agents in the very early days that came through that they lacked empathy, they lacked curiosity, they were following the steps of they were almost the perfect place if you just had an absolute sales script that you wanted them to stick to day in, day out. They'd be happy in that environment, just ticking the boxes and moving forward. So we had to build things into our recruitment process to identify, where that self-centeredness is a primary focus for the individuals. They're not a good fit for what we do. We need a high level of empathy. We need a high level of curiosity. There's got to be, an other-centered awareness as opposed to that self-centered. And I think that's what drives a lot of this silo between organisations. Sometimes it's because of the way the structure's been set up. Sometimes it's because of some KPI, or the structure can magnify it or exaggerate it. The KPIs can exaggerate it. But I think the reality, it's actually driven by the individuals more than the structure itself, because I've seen some structures and KPIs that you would think would be completely destructive in terms of a cohesive environment, and yet they're operating so well together because it's almost like the individuals are cohesive in spite of the structure that's been set up and the KPIs that have been set. I think it's very, very individual. And that was an interesting thing about the conversation with Mark yesterday, is that it's driven by ourselves and what's in our own head, I think, is as much or even more than structure and so forth.
Yeah. I do think that's where it comes back to making sure we understand the company and the people own that, right? So when I talk about loop logic, it is your leadership has to drive this understanding of interconnective tissue. A phrase that I will say I've coined, but another hill I'll die on, is that people power profits, both those you serve and those that help you serve them. And I thought where a lot of companies falter is in not remembering the second part of that, the people who help you serve them. The companies that I see with the greatest success are not only very much positioned against their buyer, the people that they're serving, to power their profits, but they're also really smart about listening to their internal people, being able to elevate their internal people that are helping with driving that core delivery to the buyer and putting them as part of their focus. I've seen so many good people in different departments. A couple times, some really key members and a couple clients I've had, like in the sales team, that just took a lot of initiative on their own, some got recognized. In one company, I saw two that were just so good. They partnered with marketing very clean. They made sure they talked to the customer success like lead director and got feedback. And then when they had sales calls, they did the right sales techniques of making sure they researched the person before they got in. They were the highest converting. The leader of that company did not pay enough attention. And despite what us as other leaders would highlight as, hey, these individuals need that support, that elevation, we should do something with this, didn't listen. They lost those salespeople. Those salespeople went to other companies that did listen. And I think that's a really key point that people need to understand. When we're talking about these, like making sure your positioning, your pipeline, your people, and your performance are all interconnected, that people aspect can't get forgotten. We're orienting around the buyer, but the people who make that happen are so critical. And the insight that they gather, especially today when people in current tech, especially when we think about B2B SaaS and tech companies, they're not sitting in a company for longer than 1 to maybe 3 years. We have a lot of job hopping, which is not a bad thing. It does a lot of benefit for companies with talent, but it also does a lot of benefit for the individual as they grow in their career. But because of that, if you're not making the most out of taking advantage and creating systems that take their knowledge and their insights and operationalize it in your business, when they move, they take it with them. And the number of times I've seen companies that don't have that operating system oriented around the buyer where they get that information woven in, they're almost always starting from scratch as they lose key people and key members.
You mentioned PLG earlier, and I think it's a good time to bring it up now. The B2C, B2B, the reality in all of it, it's B2H, it's B to hum, business to human, it's business to person. And whether your product is something that is simple to use and low cost, that can be potentially a product-led play, there are still people on the other side of it. For now, anyway, I haven't seen AI agents out there doing all the buying at this stage, and I think it'll be a little while before we do, but there's still people involved in that loop. The reality is that whether they're employees, the example you just gave in terms of recognition, or their customers, and the example in terms of customer success, staying close, making sure there's alignment in the messaging they're getting from marketing and then through sales, then into customer success, making sure onboarding processes, there's always if somebody needs to speak to a person, then there's a person available. This people aspect of the business. I remember quite a few decades ago, sitting in the Sydney Entertainment Centre it was Bob Ansett who set up Budget Rent-A-Car. He was talking about his business and what had made the success in his business. And he said, first and foremost, we're in the people business. And that's something that has just stuck with me forever. It was very aligned to my values to start with. And hey, look, here we are now running a people business, a staffing live chat staffing agency. The reality is, I think that too many times organizations will try and take people out of the loop in a way to increase efficiencies or to make things more automated. When I think the real value is in those human-to-human conversations, and that's the way to forge a real connection. Product-led growth or product-led sales is great, but where is the long-term relationships? How do you forge a long-term relationship, a bond, when there's no real person-to-person connection in the organization? They're using your product, they're using software. They don't know anyone in the organization.
Yeah.
A competitor comes along tomorrow with something similar that's cheaper, they're gone. Someone comes along at the same price that does a better job or solves something slightly different to what you do, they're gone. It's an interesting perspective, but I think that person-to-person component, you can see I'll die on this hill, quite frankly. That's the hill that I'll die on, is that I think people, and just as employees need to be recognised, customers need to be recognised as well.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point too, because, and again, we'll come back to this comment of, it depends on what your product's doing. It depends on how it operationalizes. It depends on what kind of value it's serving. But if you are doing a smart job of putting the value of the buyer at the forefront of everything, and it drives everything, and your customers see that value, that paired with ease of getting in touch with someone, but also internal systems that can recognize power users, power brands, key accounts that allow you to expand on. The cost for net new customers is always going to be higher than being able to maintain and grow existing customer bases. Let's talk about because I worked with a lot of great product-led companies, hybrid companies, This isn't to say the product-led model doesn't work. It works really well with a lot of people. It's got a really great methodology to the way that they operationalize with users very fast, get them into paid formats and get them scaled out. And they have a very great methodology for recognizing brands and how do they get into key accounts and expand there. That is something that you have to work into your back-end operation. We're back
Yes.
to knowing your buyer, what they need, what they value, and how they work, knowing your accounts that those buyers work for, and being able to have back-end systems that can flag internally for your operations to see, hey, we just had this big conglomerate company sign up as a test user for our solution, and this is a director level person that is going to be a possible power user. How do we make sure we recognize and take action in the right way to support the value they're getting and create stickiness and then hopefully create some expansion? This whole buyer centricity comes in at every stage here. It's so critical across all of that. And anyway, that was my slight little rant there, but I think it's so important to make sure you don't think that this buyer centricity is just this idea that we have that it's the best way to operate. It truly is the greatest success rate to revenue. And I keep hounding on this concept of not just sustainable revenue, but like sustainably compounding revenue is something that I like to focus on with companies. Is how do we create back-end systems and pull certain levers, what I like to call the pivotal points of growth. It's something that I actually have as a framework. There are like 6 key levers or spaces in which you operationalize inside of this buyer-led operating system in order to make sure that you are making the most out of the value you're getting to them and that you're making sure your operations are fueling that, are supporting that, and are also being adapted and updated every single time you need to in order to keep that going, to keep that kind of perpetual momentum that you're getting and not find yourself backtracking at any point and losing that revenue, but rather constantly compounding that growth potential as you go forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's really interesting. I hear a lot of leaders talk about, we're a buyer-centric organization. I can generally call bullshit within 90 seconds. One quick visit to their website, you can generally see whether they're really are buyer-centric or not. You gave the example just there before of the salespeople not being recognised in an organisation. But you work across a lot of industries. Where do you see companies typically fall short in connecting? Where do companies typically fall short in connecting pipeline, positioning, and performance?
There's a couple places there. There's one thing so I build this with every client I work with, and this is not, I'm a big believer of there's no such thing as gatekeeping. If you're gatekeeping as a marketer or a leader in the world, then you're doing no service to the greater good. I build something, it's called a buyer operational map. And I have 3 core components to it. The top is what the buyer goes through. So you have to fully uproot yourself from you being inside the company and put yourself in the shoes of that buyer. This is the hardest part for every company. This is often the biggest failing point. Is once you're in a company, it is so hard to have some objective view from outside. And this is why you end up hiring experts externally, because they can bring that to you. But you have to get a full perspective and understanding of what do they go through, that thing that you can't own necessarily, but at least mapping what you can do hopefully internally without that external expertise right now is understand at the point in which they might stumble upon you. What is their experience against you from their perspective? So do they land on your website? Do they experience certain information? Do they have a certain flow that they go through? Are there conversion points? What does that look like? And you understand that from their perspective. The second layer down is understanding that from your internal operations. What are the different systems and yes/no flows that happen? What's the team involved? So you have, say, a kind of social media manager who's at a touch point that gets someone who came in through a chat on a social channel, and how do you get them into the site where they're not the site with the conversion point? And how are they going from that conversion point into your CRM? We've been able to tag that they're this type of company, so they go straight to an account manager as opposed to a BDR or something like that. This understanding of your back-end operational flow, do you have that? Is that mapped out? If you don't, as a business, understand that. And I don't just mean like the marketing branch, and I don't just mean the sales branch. You should have this from the point of any point of initial contact engagement, understanding that I now have a person. There's a name, or contact point that I now can identify an anonymous user into a known person? And what is our entire process flow? Every single touch point, every single yes, no, if, then factor, from marketing through sales, from sales conversion into customer onboarding, from customer onboarding to customer lifetime. And what does that look like? If you don't have that mapped out, you're giving yourself a significant disadvantage to where you could scale and grow. It is the best place to understand where you have gaps, where you have greatest opportunity, where should you be tracking certain things. And then the third layer to that, I always like to map out, this is me going from originally being a very creative marketer and brander at first to growing up in the dawn of marketing operations, is know what tech is serving where. So every single one of those, you have, what is the buyer experiencing? What is your backend operations that's making that happen? What's the technology that is activated at that moment? Is there a source of truth, of ownership, of data at a certain point? Is there a secondary software that's coming in to activate chat tools and things like that? So this mapping is something that is one of the first things I do with any company that I'm working with that doesn't have it, because it is the fastest way to identify, are your teams siloed? Are they working together? Are you actually putting the buyer experience through down into your operations first? And that's the fastest way for you to identify what do you need to fix versus what are opportunities to enhance. And you can create some really great ways to find cost reductions. Are you wasting money somewhere in a tech tool that's never even activated? Are you losing data points? Do you have regular feedback loops from certain systems that are operating at different points? That's what would be my huge component that would help operationalize what we're talking about, buyer-centric, operating systems.
Are there friction points is the other big one. We've done over 5,000. It was 5,006 was the number, but it's quite a few more than that now. Inbound funnel reviews. We'll go through, and from the customer's first touch perspective, right through until we get all the way through to getting a demo, but at the very least, understanding what that inbound funnel looks like. And the amount of friction, and in my mind, and I should define that, friction is not just steps or number of fields in a form, it's also the amount of time or the amount of changing channels that a customer needs to do from getting from that first question that they've got in their mind through to actually having a conversation with a salesperson. And you would be shocked. You would be absolutely shocked at organizations that you would look at. The brands are well known and you would think these guys have got it and should have it nailed. The hoops that they make customers jump through, I understand the logic behind it, and it's perpetuated by the software providers in most cases, where they'll say gatekeep, you'll get the email address, it's a lead. The reality is that it's not true. It's an absolute, I don't want to call it a lie. I understand where it's come from, but the world has changed so much. The buyer's process has changed so much now. Their inherent trust levels have changed so much now. If you ask somebody for an email address, then you're likely pushing that potentially highly qualified buyer away. And so your point about gatekeeping, I think there's an argument to gatekeep on some items. For instance, if you're an organization and you have access to, the Gartner quadrant reports or something along those lines that's relevant for your industry, it's not necessarily something you've produced. If people are interested in that, I guess that's, for me, you could potentially get an email address to send the Gartner report to. That's showing that somebody's interested to a certain extent. But with your own content, make it so valuable that they want to come back. It's not so good that they want to come back and you have to put an email address to try and capture them. Why are you putting that piece of content out?
And that was another thing that died off pretty fast in companies in the last couple of years is doing gated content. And understanding if you're not adding some very unique value with that form field to get them as a lead, then they're probably not filling it out. This is just tripled in concept when it comes to now that a lot of them will turn to AI for their answers. So if you're providing some how to do XYZ, please enter your email so we can give you our technically a blog article or something like that would answer those questions. They're just going to go to a free channel. So that's been another thing when it comes to growth hacking and a few other things that have died off on the vine is definitely assets and gating content has to have extreme value to make them see a reason to give you that email. And so there's a lot of thoughtfulness that goes into what qualifies there. But there's also, to your example, I just was chatting with a company that they had a sign up process for new customers. They were chatting with me and they were wondering why they're having such a low lead conversion. And so we started going through the process, and we come to find out is, well, they had leads coming in, which is great, straight into the product, immediately able to test it out. However, the process to get from I start and I get to actually do something was like a 25-step process. So as opposed to getting in, I fill out my email and I activate my account with a password, then they had to go in and verify their email. So then they had to go to their email and they had to go verify it. And then after that, they had to verify their phone number as a second form of authentication. And this is actually just to even get in to see how the back end of the system works. And so I pull up a competitor that has a significantly faster path to get there. Now, mind you, they gate functionality after you get to experience a certain level of the product on the back end. But that's when they've gotten to see, okay, I can see what I can get out of here. I can see the value. Now I have to actually either pay or talk to someone, and then I can convert further into the product. But if you're giving them a 25-step process before they can even finish signing up, that's why we have no pipeline coming in, isn't it?
Look, absolutely true. And I think that gating, once it's almost like that free trial where they've seen it, they've accessed it, they understand or experience the value, then of course, again, we're all in business to make money. And so, that's the commercial reality of their flow. We have been so focused on making sure that onboarding is easy for our clients that it's literally, we do all of the work. The clients need to do a little bit of checking, but we do all of the work. We've actually started a new process now for our pilots where it's almost like a light, where literally you don't have to lift a finger. You put a snippet of code on your website and we'll be live in 48 hours with no touch whatsoever. We use your existing CTAs on the website. It's a way for organisations, smaller organisations, to get a sense in terms of a bit of the free trial, but it's also a way for larger organisations to get a pilot and get a sense of some of the potential. That's not how you unleash the full potential of what we do, but it certainly does give you some sense of what the potential, in fact, what it does, whilst it's showing you the potential, it's giving you much more insight into what you're actually missing out on in terms of the conversions on your website. So,
well, you're a good example of being buyer-centric, right? You understand where you could create ease for people to use you and then immediate value. So that is just such a key component here. If you can make it easy for them to immediately get to value or see value and experience it, that's such an easy way to get to stickiness and conversion.
Yeah, it is. And so we haven't really launched it properly. I've done a little bit of a soft launch and it was reasonably successful. And quite frankly, we've got a couple of projects that have distracted me and I'm sitting here kicking myself now thinking we need to actually launch that properly. So that'll be this week's job. Let's have a chat about the process of framework to execution. Tactical, let's talk about tactics. What are the 6 pivotal points of growth? And why are these the levers that you always come back to?
Yeah, this is something, again, easily found. I have a page just dedicated. You can just go to pivotalpointsofgrowth.com and find it. I break down 6 key areas. 1 is buyer knowledge and connectivity. 2 is positioning and brand identity. 3 is a customer-centric pipeline design. So I even build in the words customer-centric in there again. 4 is your dynamic market activation efforts and campaign. 5, your cross-functional data and operations. And then 6 is your customer retention and expansion. And I know that was a lot, but basically we're looking at buyer, your brand, your pipeline, your activation and market, your data and ops, and then your customers, existing customers.
Attention.
And I reference this as a actual circle because they're all connected. They all influence each other. Honestly, if anything, it would be a web because there is interconnectivity between all of them. And what I talk about here is that these are foundational areas of understanding for your business that you then operationalize off of. So buyer knowledge, the number of times I've worked with a company and I've come in and I've asked the CEO what it is that, who their buyer is and then what it is they do. So we're talking about buyer and brand. And then I go to maybe a sales rep and I ask them the same question, and these are not the same answers that I'm hearing. That tells you that there's a gap in their foundations as a business in
Mm,
understanding who their buyer is and what it is they do for them. So each of these, when I talk about them as foundational because every single department, especially those that are talking to your customers, but even your product teams and anyone else internally, they need to have these foundations understood universally. So this is where we come back to that everyone shouldn't be siloed, they're interconnected. Who is your buyer? Understanding who your ICP is, understanding who your personas are, understanding who your greatest stickiness is versus maybe what's your greatest dollar value per customer, understanding where you have the greatest growth potential, and then individual kind of department has their ways in which they operationalize off of that, right? So your marketing team is going to have a certain way they work with it. There's going to be a different way in which your customer team works with it and your product teams and your sales team. Your buyer positioning, your brand positioning and your brand identity. This is something where I go back to that. We talk about the death of the sea of sameness. You need to have a unique value proposition, a unique selling point. A
mm,
good example is you look at CRMs. There are a lot of smaller brand CRMs out there or marketing automation platforms or combination. No one successful in that space that's smaller is going out there just positioning against Salesforce, right?
no.
As a CRM company, if they just went out to try to gain Salesforce's market share, good luck. You don't have that money. However, if you are a CRM or CRM marketing automation combination platform specialized in, say, real estate and realtor operation, and you know that buyer, so we go back to number one, which is knowing your buyer, and then you know your unique value. Your entire CRM system has templates and designs explicitly for real estate agents and real estate market. Then you have a significant, unique selling point. And actually,
Mm,
you'll win that over Salesforce because there's a bunch of things in Salesforce that they don't need to be able to do, nor do they want to pay the price point for. So you know your buyer better, you're positioned against them better, you're priced against them better. So your pricing team and your product teams are operationalizing off of that positioning understanding. And then you actually build your pipeline on understanding these key components. And so you can kind of see how each of these add to, right? You don't go to market without having a clear understanding of the pipeline operations that are going to bring them in, nor your positioning, nor your buyer. And so it kind of keeps going through that cycle. But I emphasize it being a circle because when you talk about your customers and your customer efforts for retention and key account expansion, that goes right back into understanding your buyer, because that's where we go back to the conversation earlier. When you understand things, post-purchase and you're like, okay, this is one of our key accounts. They've been with us for 3 years. What is it that brought them in? What has changed in our product and how they use it today in these last 3 years? And is there anything to operationalize against that back into how we understand our buyers? How can we get more of these power users in these key accounts? And then how do we position against it? And then how do we actually make sure our pipeline supports them? And then how do we activate and market? And then how do we track and have our operations against it? So these are the key points, that there's foundational elements to it. And then there's how you actually then activate and market per department against it.
So you layered these 6 points on top of something like buyer-led conversions. How does that shift the company's GTM motion?
It depends. So it'll definitely depend on who their market is and what kind of product and solution they have. But again, we came to those examples earlier of when you understand your back-end operations is serving the buyer need and understanding their core need, and that they own a lot of the key channels before they get to you. This is where these points come in, right? So knowing your buyer, well, let's go back to this real estate CRM niche, right? If you're brand new and you're, say, still in your kind of early customer acquisition, you might be finding yourself going to local events for real estate agents and maybe, and again, I'm saying this as someone who probably shouldn't be saying this without actually being in real estate, but maybe you're going to the real estate local, there's organizations and associations that are local, and
Mhm.
maybe you talk to brokerage firms and you talk to them about your CRM system. This is where we get back to, and our whole conversation is so cyclical. This gets back to where we talked about having real conversations with your potential customers to better understand them and get in front of them. You get that feedback, you get in, and you get an early case study. So say you got in with a mid-sized brokerage in your local, city, and they start using your CRM and they can report back to you in 3 months on some data metrics on how well they used it and how it's been helping them better than this legacy one they used to be on, you immediately have a fast case study. You activate that case study in with your marketing team and your sales team so that you can garner more of those. And then you start to expand to more dynamic go-to-market efforts. So you're not just showing up at associations, but you're starting to do some digital efforts. Maybe you're pumping out some new content. And maybe you are at the point that you can start to afford some advertising channels where you now know they exist because you have customers who've told you this is where we're at. So all of that's a really good way to show how, even if we're that early stage, then you just think about, say you're a bigger company, you're mid-market, you're, a CRM for that kind of niche and you're in the like 20 million ARR now. There's just a different way you operationalize that. You probably have more dynamic systems making a lot of that automated. So maybe you do have a hybrid model where smaller agents come in on a product-led model, but you have a process for full brokerages to come through on a sales-led or kind of hybrid format. So you've now operationalized the back end of your systems to recognize that when the data comes in, and you have team members that, in the sales department that gets flagged when you have a full brokerage coming in. And then you bring in that human element where they start to interact more, and that creates that stickiness. So being able to understand these 6 points, being able to understand how you operate against the buyer, no matter whether you are at first customer or you're at like mid-stage, mid-market, is still an essential component.
Absolutely. I get it. Look, thanks for explaining that, because my next question was going to be about what's the difference between, smaller businesses compared to those, larger enterprises at scale. So you've explained it very well.
Yeah.
I want to change or shift our conversation a little bit. We spoke earlier about, leadership not recognizing good performance. But I think there's a mentorship vacuum, in the go-to-market leadership right now. What do you think today's emerging leaders are missing?
Well, I think, I mentioned this comment earlier. If we're seeing a lot of role shift more often, the biggest component you realize is that your mentors in the past, when I look back to my mother who spent 30 plus years in the same company, your mentors of the past were typically your boss or some other leader in the same company. And at the time that was acceptable because you're trying to grow in that company. But now when you're looking at trying to grow a little bit more on a personal individual level, your mentor in the company may not always have just your individual best interests in mind. Their mentorship or their coaching for you in your career is going to be aligned to your role and your performance in it. And that's, again, not necessarily a bad thing because you will always have great bosses who will help you do better at your job. But there's challenges in things like recognizing when it's time for you to move jobs. And what does that look like? There are other elements like understanding, when you're new in your career, younger in your career, in early management, there's a lot of things that you're not able to see, especially if you're like a smaller startup. So the number of times I've seen, SaaS companies that are only in the like 5 to maybe 20 million ARR, and their marketing teams aren't that big. So they promote a content marketer into a marketing manager role, and they have an abundance of new issues, which is I'm no longer a doer or practitioner of small things, but I am now a manager of bigger projects and possibly people. And I am not trained or equipped for that. But I'm also now having to move from being a content expert to being a more holistic marketer or a go-to-market expert. And these are challenges that, like, if there's no one there to really assist you with on that, who's been there, done that, it can be a lot to take on. And some individuals are learning this from, just as they go through the motions, and it's very reactionary, and it can actually hurt them and their feelings about their job. Like, I can't express how many times I've definitely felt that burden, and you just don't want to go to work the next day when you lack that kind of leadership or that kind of guidance.
I think that is it's an area that I've had a lot of interest in for a long time now, particularly behavioral science, getting the most out of people, support and mentoring. The reality is that moving from a practitioner where if we're going to get into, defining what it means is, managing your own time and tasks, to moving into a management role, leadership role, where it's really getting things done through others, a completely different skill set. And, there's a statistic that we'll talk about, most new businesses won't even make it through. And I'm not talking about B2B tech in particular, but I'm actually talking more about bricks and mortar businesses or service businesses, whether it's HVAC, electrician, plumbers, all those types of businesses. Most new businesses that set up, like I think the number's 95%, don't make it through the first year. And I believe, and I've seen it, that it's because moving from a practitioner, hey, I'm an electrician, I've got wages, I get the paycheck coming in each week or each fortnight, I've got to go to work, I've got to do, wire up the house, wire up this, be part of this construction, compared to, and I'm not downplaying that at all. There's a whole level of complexity around understanding a trade and having that skill set. But when you move into starting an organization and all of a sudden you have to start worrying about marketing, where are you going to get new customers from? You have to start worrying about HR. I've got employees now. Somebody didn't turn up. Somebody hasn't got a good attitude. How do I deal with this? How do I get the best out of my people? All of a sudden, I've got to worry about the bank ringing me because the overdraft's extended too far. I've got to pay the bills and I've got to manage cash flow. I've got to worry about the numbers and the profitability each month. I need to be an accountant. How do I know whether I'm actually making money or not? And all of a sudden, I've got to price these jobs. So I've got to be a pricing expert as well to actually understand all of the components to do a proper quote to make sure I am making money and not going out backwards. And so, when you talk about it like that, the complexity that's involved in running a business, I have so much respect for business owners. I have so much empathy for business owners. They wear so many hats. Their job is probably one of the most difficult jobs that I can think of. I mean, it would be one of the hardest jobs that anyone could do ever. The second hardest job is a leadership role in a larger organisation because they're going through that same component. They don't have as much complexity in their role, but them taking the biggest step, which is going from doing the work to getting others to do the work. And that is, where there's not good, whether it's internally in the business, training, mentorship in terms of how to help people make that transition, or even I'm chatting with a person the other day who was in Salesforce and was given a stipend to put towards their development as they'd moved from, junior sales role into a senior sales, even just changing into a senior sales role, and found that, they were given a stipend rather than specific training. They didn't know where to spend the money. Where are they going to make sure that they're going to get the bang for the buck in the right training that they need? So, I think, to your point about not being there, then, that's learning the hard way when there's no mentorship. What's the cost of learning the hard way, especially when GTM complexity keeps rising?
Yeah, there's tangible and intangible costs to that, right? So I think one thing that we don't talk about enough is making the transition from that maybe more niche space of operations to a bigger go-to-market leader role is not only are you now having to navigate from this one practice and the metrics that matter there and how it works in your component of the business, but now you're asking people who might have been like content marketers or marketing operations individuals or a BDR or a salesperson now have to understand bigger picture business and understand the minutia of how the interconnective efforts of marketing, sales, and customer success. And this is why I emphasize the go-to-market leader needs to be able to put themselves in all their shoes. And there's an entire, not to call it by such a negative term, but corporate politics or even just the relationship management. How do you get to know if you're a new marketing lead and you're a manager, senior manager trying to make your way to be a VP or a possible CMO, how do you learn the business metrics that are different? Don't you dare go to a meeting with the CEO and start talking about your email click-through rates. This could put you in a bad light. How do you transition to understanding marketing's impact to revenue and reporting it accurately? Not only how do you then, manage your team underneath it, but then are you having relationship building efforts with your sales leader so that you guys are coming to conversations at the big table with you guys in the same pocket? The best way to break down silos is going to be having your leaders across departments support that and understand that and empower it within up to leadership, their own leadership, the owners of the company, and down into their teams. There's the individual learning lesson, but giving things like stipends, it's great, but you don't know what to do with it. And it's such a waste of possible time, mental energy when you have to make those mistakes yourself or go through that process yourself. And there's just so many, I found in my career, the thing that I enjoy a lot now is that mentorship aspect. I still have
Yeah.
people that I used to work with at other companies that I talk to periodically and jump on calls. I had one that I would consider a friend now who reached out and said, "Hey, I'm struggling with something at my company. I'd love to just soundboard with you." And it's just an opportunity to have someone who's in your court who has no stakes in the game and no bias towards the interests of the company, but just the interest to you to help you navigate a situation that maybe they've already been through before, whether they've experienced it or know people have experienced it, to help you be quicker to learn things, to grow faster, grow smarter. That's how it is in everything. If you can learn from someone else's mistakes or successes and be able to activate on it faster, it just makes it easier for you, but also makes it more rewarding for you. I hate to see young professionals have disdain for their job simply because they lack guidance or support for them to navigate it in a confident manner.
You and I are very aligned as far as that is concerned, the whole mentoring piece. Likewise, I'm still have, relationships that have turned into friendships now where they've been not so in the past. There's a flip side to that though, isn't there? Not doing that, not having that available. If you think about the cost of learning the hard way, it's easy to put your finger on and say, okay, well, the cost of learning the hard way is you're going to make mistakes, which means you're not going to get the returns that you should be getting and you're going to waste money. That's one side of it. But there's other aspects to it as well. I think in that individual's development can be delayed or in fact damaged to such an extent that they'll fail in the role. And the cost of replacing someone in a role is far more than training them properly and setting them up for success.
Yeah.
And I think the other component to that, or the other cost component to that, is that within their own team, when they don't have faith in the leader and the leader's struggling, or the leader's doing the wrong thing and not having their behaviour adjusted, then that can create exits from within the team, people not wanting to be in that environment, and so they'll leave. So the real cost of learning the hard way, there's a cost for the individual, but there's a much, much larger cost for the organisation compared to the investment required to actually set them up for success.
Yep. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. When you're in these smaller companies, and I say smaller, but I mean, you think about how lean some teams operate for high revenue companies in tech and in SaaS. How small some of those teams can be shocking to those from the outside world, but not shocking to us who work with them regularly. But you can have a very small marketing team where, yeah, you elevated someone, but maybe you had your VP change out, VP of marketing, decided to move out to another role somewhere else or something like that, and you are elevating a director. Do they have the resources and tools to do that? And maybe you do something like as genuinely as possible, give them the stipend and try to get them. But if they don't have direction on where to go, and you don't have someone internally who can help send them in the right direction of where to spend that money to actually wisely generate this new knowledge they need to have, it can be difficult. And you're right. It creates possible slowdowns in the business success, because now you have to slow your in-market operations to compensate for a learning curve that you might have in a new elevated person. And it's no fault to them and no fault to the business. It's just a part of the process of having someone trying to grow in their position as you're also trying to activate your business and market.
But the reality is, even for smaller organisations, there are ways that you can set people up for success. A stipend is one thing, but I think, that's almost the easy way out or the cheap way out. I think as leaders in organisation, whether you're at CEO or founder level, or whether perhaps you're a CMO that's promoted a junior marketer into a more seniorship role, responsibility sits very squarely on your shoulders to set that person up for success. Your responsibility is to take the first steps to understand, okay, and have something in place. Look, quite transparently, this is almost a perfect segue into, your mentorship cohort. Who's that for and what problems are you trying to solve with that?
Yeah. So, we've been talking about this. This is something that I had in the back of my mind of something that I wanted to launch for years. And it's finally kind of reached the point where I'm bringing it to fruition. My goal is to try to solve some of this gap. I've been through a lot in my career, not to say I've been through everything, but I've been on the side of layoffs. I've survived them. I've been a part of them. I've been a part of making the decision in them. I've had to navigate, being let go for other reasons. I've had to navigate proactively choosing to leave a company and go to another, and all in the path of my own career decisions. But I've also worked with and helped guide a lot of individuals and companies that, whether I was in-house at that company or if I actually was consulting with them or working as their fractional CMO or advisor. And that gap of having someone who is authentically in their corner without the stakes in the game is something that I've wanted to solve for. So I'm currently right now starting off with a kind of early founding group. It's going to be a little bit of a smaller group, but that definitely means I'll have a little bit more one-on-one mentoring time with me because I want them to help shape what this turns into, bigger picture. But I'm looking probably more at right now leaning into marketing individuals who are probably in management into senior management, who are trying to as best navigate their path to director and VP roles. Obviously, the long-term goal might be to be a CMO. Maybe it's to start your own business. I've done that as well. But, this is who I'm looking for. I'm looking for those that are probably marketers in the B2B tech space, tech to SaaS space that are trying to navigate the senior managing role into becoming a director, becoming a VP. There might be some that are in early director roles that are now also trying to just get comfortable there. That might apply here too. It'll be a smaller group, but the goal is to kind of create a community space where we can kind of let them all share what they're going through and what that experience is like for them to be able to ask questions. I will host some regular AMAs with them, and then I'd like to do some one-on-ones. Ideally, the long-term picture would be is this would expand into a broader group of professionals within the same kind of space. And I could start to bring in some of the people that I know and love that are experts in other areas. Like I have a great friend, Wendy, who is an expert in executive HR and hiring, and she has a great perspective there. I have a few other friends and associates that are in operations, that are in sales, that are in customer success, those that deal with other types of challenges. There's things that we didn't even talk about here, but like the dynamics, for example, that I can speak to personally of being a woman growing in a predominantly male space. And how do you grow in leadership and how do you navigate that? And I think that there's a lot of great experts that I could bring in over time. But so that's what I'm starting off, the smaller group. I'm looking to kind of launch in with them in the beginning of December, hopefully giving some time over the holidays for some personal development and learning. And especially as we go into the new year, I'm sure a lot of people are going to have some plans to orient, but I think everyone should feel really good about their career and their path in it and feel confident in it. And I want to be a resource for that. So that's what I'll be kicking off then.
And so for clarity, this is much more about the individual and their career as opposed to, how do I improve the conversion rate on my landing?
Yeah, somewhat, right? So part of this is giving them that mentoring for them as they grow from early management into director into VP. Part of it is to help, and that's why I'm oriented around marketers, is I want them to help figure out how to get out of these siloed spaces that I know very well and become a go-to-market leader. So we will go over things and talk about how do we think like a go-to-market leader? How do I bridge these gaps that could be existing in these silos? How do I operationalize on these 6 pivotal points of growth in my team? I would love to share frameworks and tools and resources that I have that can help them be more successful faster at doing those things in their companies. So yes, it's kind of a mixed component, a little bit of the learning lessons to shift from, niche marketer to a go-to-market leader, as well as how to grow as an individual in that effort as well.
That's wonderful. How about something along the lines of, what's the best way for marketers that have been promoted into management or leadership role where the organisation is not necessarily providing development or mentoring type opportunities? What can they do? Something along those lines?
Yeah, I think that could work because then I could emphasize into find those who've been there, done that. And then I'll of go into this is why I'm starting this.
Yeah, okay. So for marketers that have been promoted into management or leadership roles in an organisation that hasn't really set them up for success or doesn't have the internal resources to be able to set them on the path of mentorship or development, what should they do?
The best piece of advice I can give there is to find those who have possibly been there, done that. That is something that I've tried to do in my past. This is things I emphasize to anyone that I work with and collaborate with. Find someone who has experienced that, who has made that transition. The people that we say are like 3 steps ahead of you or more that are willing to give that time. That's part of the hard part though, right? trying to find someone who's a VP or CMO who has time to give you, to mentor you, that's not already actively mentoring their existing employees is a little difficult. So that's why I'm starting this, community cohort effort that I'm doing is I find passion and joy in being able to be that person who's in their corner, that has no stakes in the game, that is looking to support them and honestly disseminate some of the good and the bad and in the history of how I gotten to where I am and those lessons learned. But I do this regularly with the companies that I work with. It's a great opportunity to do this with individuals, especially as today we own a lot of our own career journey now. Just like we talked about, the buyer leads a lot of their journey now. When it comes to discovering products, we are leading a lot of our career journey as we see a lot more short-term employment within companies and a disconnect there. So that's where I'd like to come in and help.
And the real value of an individual when they're looking at being recruited by an organization is that skill set, that level of development that they've had and how well that they can present and what value they can bring to an organization. That development really sits much more on their own shoulders now than, the longer term employees that had organizations that had a program in place that might last for 3 or 4 years. That's just really not happening so much these days because there is so much movement. Employers don't want to invest because they feel they're not getting a return. They'll rather find people that already have that. So very good. Excellent initiative.
Yeah, wonderful.
So in sort of wrapping things up, for go-to-market leaders listening who know they need to move towards a more buyer-led thinking, where should they start?
Start at making sure they know their buyer. I think it comes back to starting with the insights, the data points, and even doing some of the qualitative work to find that information about your buyer. Are you adding value? What is it the value they care about? And are you serving to it and how? So I think that is a key component to making sure they're at the forefront. Do you truly understand them? Do you have that recognized in the team? Something that I love to do with people is try to create data points that understand the buyer. So can we create a drop-down list that breaks down key pain points of our ideal buyer? And are we actually tracking against that as we do operations within a team? So I think that's the top one. Start at making sure you have the right understanding of who your ICP is, who's your key personas in there. These aren't just little documents that you keep in a Google Drive or in a Microsoft, space just for people to look at periodically. You actually do operationalize on your ICP documents and your persona documents. And then I think from there, you can make those kind of next steps on how do I position to it.
So tactically, something that the audience could actually walk away and start this afternoon tactically, what would be the first real step to take in terms of getting to understand the buyers better?
If you have it and you're big enough as a company, I would look at your existing customer insights. I think that is going to be one of if you have your ICP and your ideal buyer is who you have as customers, I would go to your power users or your key customers, depending on whether you're a product or a software, and I'd look at your insights on them. I would ask questions. I would make sure and start with internal questions, talk to your customer success managers, and make sure that you talk to them and not just randomly reached out as a marketer to a key account. But I think start with the data and that's been proven. You have a customer that's been sticky and they love your product. They are a power user. They're an advocate. Why? Can you answer that question, why? And then from answering that question, why, what can I do to create more of them? And then you can bring that to the front of your funnel, the front of your pipeline. How do I take what I just learned from those ideals that love our product, work with it well? How can I get more of them in front?
And so conversely, even for all smaller organizations that might not necessarily have that level of process in place, it's still thinking about their current existing customers and what was potentially going back through the original sales calls and understanding what was their concerns and pain points then and start to build that out. Then you would want to have the conversation with the customers so that you do actually understand what their perspective are.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. And I would emphasize, don't go to that conversation unprepared. So definitely do that research. Take a look at where did you have friction points before they converted? Some of the best practices I've actually had is when we have the ability to, is I've talked to, on behalf of a kind of almost anonymous third party, I've talked to both existing customers and closed, lost potential customers. And I've had conversations with them, letting them know I'm looking for feedback on behalf of this client. and had a very genuine conversation with very prepared question points that I wanted to know based on what I saw in the filter of their sales process or their
Mm-hmm.
filter of their marketing into sales process. So I think that's a really great point. And then even going smaller, if you're even smaller as a company and you don't even have some of those data points, it goes back to know who your ideal person is, your ideal company and ideal buyer, and having a conversation with them, and then understanding their objections. So if you don't have that post-purchase data, you go into the sales process data. If you don't have that, you go into your assumptions. But the goal is as you start to actually garner customers and data points, you should be able to inform those deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So what's one move you've seen that feels risky, super risky, but has outsized upside when teams actually trust the buyer journey?
I've seen some companies dramatically shift their full foundational assets and messaging when we've gone through a practice of deep diving on their ideal customer. I'll give a good example, actually. I worked with a client where they had a actual great traction in the e-commerce market, and they are a service provider that was doing a particular type of marketing service in the e-commerce space, but they had started to garner some new traction in the health tech space. It was something that they saw potential in, but did not have the resources to necessarily continue their not really growing, just stagnant ownership of the e-commerce space, but wanted to start to see if they can grow more in that digital health space. And so I actually worked with them on doing some of that data insights. We did some research in market. We did some existing customer actual interviews. And I
Mm-hmm.
did some interviews with other CMOs who work in health tech companies. So I used my own network for that. And we got to know, what do they actually care about? And does this seem like the greatest potential? And we got a lot of yeses. We saw a lot of growth potential in there. We saw a lot of key account potential too, where you get into the company and expand it out. And so we did an entire effort together where I worked as their fractional CMO, completely reshaped their ICP and their key personas against that health tech focus. We redesigned the entire messaging and positioning and the whole website against that. And then we actually started to do the activation in market. They were already good at doing some thought leadership efforts holistically in the service they provided, but now started to work with a key person in the team to make them into a micro influencer and a credibility source. Remember that authenticity in the core market. And then started shifting some of their thought leadership to not just be in that practice, but that practice for that space. And we did see some great results. Immediately, I think within the first quarter of the new launch of the website, they garnered one of their biggest accounts. And when they talked to them on the sales call, they asked, why did you come to us? And they said, I went to your website and you spoke exactly to the things that we needed solved. And I can't, that was such a feel good moment for me as the marketer involved in it, because that means they understood the buyer, they spoke the words that they needed to see, they knew the value they added, and they were hitting the mark on their core shopping page, their core storefront of the website. And that garnered an organic lead in their ideal customer and a huge elephant account. So I think that's a really good example for me to think of, that some of these the things you can't necessarily measure right away, but you have to kind of trust the process of, we're doubling down on, we know this is a good potential with the market. We're going to make sure we know them, we speak to them. And then it came to fruition as a huge revenue contributor. But those first 6 months leading up to that, when we were in initial development and initial launching phases, is a lot of trust in that process to get there, and it came to fruition. So
And the risk is that if it doesn't work, then it's all being for naught and the whole investment's being wasted. But look, I think that's where the preparation and, the one thing that we keep talking about here is know your customer from both of our perspectives.
It's about validating in that process, right? I would never have led them down that path to fully redo everything against that if in that process we had checkpoints where we made sure this was a valid assumption, right? So there is a validation process to that shift. So even though we have a lot of trust in the game to get there, there is steps that you take as a marketing leader and as the owner of the company did with me to make sure we are confident in the assumptions we're making and we are using data to inform it from the market, even if we don't have the data internally yet.
So I almost feel like the next question I'm going to ask you, which will be my last question, is if listeners remember one thing about buyer-led conversions, buyer centricity, or the frameworks you've shared, what should it?
Okay. If one thing out of all of that, God, don't disconnect. I think I go back to the people, power, profits notion again. Like the people, power, profits, those you serve and those that help you serve them. If that is like a keynote I can have people walk away with, is don't disconnect from the buyer value. So out of those two components, the people that you serve and the people that help you serve them, I would say the key thing to walk away with is buyer value is everything. If they don't see value, if you're not serving that value, your path to growth, success, and revenue is going to be faltered, right? That would be my biggest component. If you aren't serving value, if you're not still aligning to the value, or if you disconnect, going back to the first thing we talked about at the very beginning, if you start to put the potential for a little bit of extra margin over the value that you're serving to the customer, if it compromises the value, I don't do a lot of guarantees, but I guarantee down the road, you'll see that negatively impact your market share and your revenue.
So it's almost the case of what you're saying is make sure that the value for the buyer is at the central core of everything that you do.
Yes.
Buyer centricity.
Right. This
has been a very circular conversation.
It's a core fundamental. We're not talking about anything that's new. The reason why a product exists, a service exists, is to serve a buyer need or a buyer want. And that is the core. If that was honestly so you need to make sure you're adding the value and doing that service. And that would be the key kind of point there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Monique, it's been a wonderful conversation.
I think we had a good, robust conversation here.
I've enjoyed it immensely. We'll have all the links, obviously, particularly to your mentorship cohort, but obviously how other people can get in touch with you at the bottom of the podcast here. I've enjoyed your second guest appearance on the chat, and thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.